I think either President Trump himself or some key member of his inner circle got everything completely wrong. I think the way they calculated the tariffs other countries are charging the United States is wrong, and it is very much flawed. And it is very dangerous that the top leadership of the United States will come up with such clumsy mathematics or arithmetics, which should be shocking to start with.
Donald Trump has announced heavy tariffs on countries around the world, with the toughest levies on the nations he believes poses the biggest threat to US trade. Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Commission. She spoke on behalf of Europe at about what we think was about 5 o'clock in the morning, Brussels time. So she got up very early to say this. This is what she said in response to the tariffs imposed on Europe at 20%.
President Trump's announcement of universal tariffs on the whole world, including the European Union, is a major blow to the world economy. I deeply regret this choice. Let's be clear-eyed about the immense consequences. The global economy will massively suffer. Uncertainty will spiral and trigger the rise of further protectionism. The consequences will be dire for millions of people around the globe.
China received one of the harshest tariffs. That's an additional 34% on top of the 20% that had already been added to them. Victor Gao is the Vice President of Centre for China and Globalisation, who joins us now to reflect on what it means for China. Victor, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Your reaction. It's a great pleasure. Your reaction to these tariffs?
Well, first of all, philosophically speaking, launching a tariff war against so many countries in such a big amount is not constructive. It's not going to help the United States to achieve its goal, and it will be very harmful to the economies of so many countries in the world. Secondly, this is probably the largest scale of tariff war for the past 100 years. It's very much unprecedented, and it will be very much damaging to the global economy, most likely pushing the global economy and economy of many countries into big recession. China will do two things. One is to stand firm and retaliate, even though I've noticed that the total amount of Chinese announced retaliation is much smaller than the total amount and the percentage of the tariffs imposed by the United States. Secondly, China has already started negotiating with the WTO, try to get its message across. And this is not only for China's sake, it's also for so many other countries being negatively impacted by this tariff war. So I think it is war. It is very destructive, not constructive at all. And I hope President Trump and people around him will soon recognize that it's not going to help whatever goal the United States is aiming at.
Trump says that China charges 67% tariffs on the US. That's why he came up with a 34% figure, which is half of that. Does China recognize that it imposes 67% tariffs on the US?
Absolutely not. I think either President Trump himself or some key member of his inner circle got everything completely wrong. I think the way they calculated the tariffs other countries are charging the United States is wrong, and it is very much flawed, and it is very dangerous that the top leadership of the United States will come up with such clumsy mathematics or arithmetics, which should be shocking to start with. And if they use this as the basis of their policy making, it will be totally destructive to global trade. Secondly, China and the United States are completely different economies. China is the largest developing economy in the world, whereas the United States is the largest developed country in the world. Whereas the United States does have a deficit in goods trade with China, the United States has a surplus in terms of the service sold to the Chinese companies. So I think President Trump needs to be very balanced in looking at trading goods versus trading service. Further, allow me to emphasize another point. Because the US dollar remains the dominant currency in the world, now, as a matter of logic, if you want to keep the US dollar as the dominant currency in the world, not only for international settlement, but also for reserve, etc., by logic, the United States should run a deficit. Because otherwise, if the United States does not have a deficit in its trade with other countries, what's the use of the dollar in terms of the international trade and the settlement, for example? So I think someone need to really advise President Trump in a very rational way that this is the wrong thing. You got everything wrong. And tariff war at such a large scale is unprecedented for at least the past 100 years.
Victor Gao, good to speak to you. Good to get the Chinese perspective, because we're going to try and track all the different reactions around the world, and important to hear what the Chinese are saying straight away. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's
Bye-bye.
Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation. This is war. China will stand firm. This notion, which I think we might try and unpick a bit as we go along. We've got various economic experts on the show. Where did these numbers come from?
Well, yeah, that and you know, they're obviously not. I mean, China clearly doesn't recognise that that is the tariff that's levied. I mean, it's a complicated tariff picture to set one tariff across every different sector.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily how it works either. We'll speak to experts here who can explain what the UK's rates are and how the 10% matches up. Also worth flagging there, Victor Gao saying that China is negotiating, he said the WTO, he means the World Trade Organization. There is a question about the legality of what Donald Trump is doing, because the legislation he's using to impose these tariffs around the world is only to be used in emergency or war situations. And if you really note the language that Donald Trump and allies were using last night, he talks about an emergency in American economics. That is clearly being used to justify the use of this legislation. But I wouldn't be surprised, and we've heard from experts throughout the week who suggest that there might well be legal ramifications and challenges to some of these tariffs, and potentially the negotiations with the World Trade Organization could be a really interesting thing to watch.
One big, beautiful bill. I like to name it that if you can. One big, I made that statement about 6 months ago, and everybody calls it one big, beautiful bill. And it will be that. It'll have everything, the big tax cuts and every incentive there is. It'll be fantastic. And by the way, for the cars, we're asking for an interest deduction on a loan. So if you build the car only in America, we do it, Brian. If the car's not built in America, you don't get the interest rate deduction. But if you build the car in America, if you buy a car, if it's built in America, then you get an interest rate deduction, tax deduction, and that's a big thing. It's going to be a big thing. I think that's going to pay for itself very quickly, that deduction. Never happened. We've never had anything like that before. Somebody said, where do you get the idea? Because it's so basic. You would think that would have happened a long time ago. It never did, and I'm very happy it didn't, because now I can say that was my idea. But we're going to get us closer to the debt extension. We have to get the debt extension passed, and I know you're going to be able to do that.